Welcome to Mysterious Circumstances podcast. I am your host, Justin, and I am joined by B.R. Bates, who wrote a fantastic book, and we are going to talk about that today. It is called The Crack City Strangler, and it's the homicides of serial killer Benjamin Atkins. And I was just telling BR here that being so close to Detroit, I've never really heard of this before. And there were 12 victims and one survivor, if I'm not mistaken. And super intrigued. And yeah, BR, welcome to Mysterious Circumstances.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right. So tell us how you got started in this genre and what pulled you to this case in particular.
Well, I didn't start out writing in true crime, definitely not. And I really didn't even have an interest in it until I would say the last 10, 15 years. I started watching the TV shows and the many, many TV shows that are out there in true crime, like all the stuff on the Oxygen network these days. I remember
Oh,
when Oxygen used to be like just women's programming when it
yes.
wasn't completely true crime. But yeah, I started watching all of those shows and I really found like myself very intrigued by these cases, especially like with Dateline, because a lot of the Dateline episodes that I watched, it would start out with a crime, but they wouldn't tell you who did it. And they would unfold everything gradually, and they would do interviews with people who were involved. And you kind of had to guess a lot of the time, okay, who actually committed the crime? I loved that stuff. So, with the interest in true crime more recently, I had a mutual friend who, with a cop who worked the case of a serial killer in Detroit back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Dr. Gerald Cliff. He worked a case of John Eric Armstrong with the Violent Crime Task Force for Detroit Police. And so we had a mutual friend who introduced us because Jerry always had this case that he worked on that he thought would make a good book project.
Sure.
And my mutual friend asked me, well, are you interested in writing something like that? Because I had written lots of books over the years, but just completely different stuff. I tend to write in more of a features department area. I write about classic TV shows that I love. I write novels and stuff like that. And I've done that for quite a while. But I thought about it and I heard more about the case and I became really interested in it and decided to take on that project. So I worked with Jerry on that. He collaborated with me, and that was the first book in the Murders in the Motor City series. That was about the baby doll serial killer. And then I wanted to follow it up with something because I had such time doing this research, believe it or not. I mean, we're talking about a serial killer here, but I was so fascinated by it from a psychological perspective that I thought, I want to do something else. I don't want to just end it with this book. And I would say the other pretty prominent serial killer in Detroit is Benjamin Atkins, even though on a national basis or maybe on a global basis, he's a little less known. His name
Yeah.
does come up in conversations sometimes. Like if you look at a conversation on Reddit about serial killers, somebody will mention Tony Atkins sometimes. So he's out there, but he's just not as well known as a lot of these serials.
All right, that's pretty interesting. So why don't you so you said you got into the psychological aspect of it. What drew you into that? Just the victimology, or was it more about his just his life, his surroundings? Would you think he's more of a, I don't want to say just somebody taking advantage of the social situation that he was surrounded in, or did he have like a deep-seated type of hatred or something?
Yeah, there was definitely a deep-seated hatred there.
Okay.
And as far as the psychology of this killer, oh my goodness, he's really complicated and he is definitely a puzzle to try to solve. But yes, I was also interested in the victims in both of these cases that I researched. Um, Ironically, the Atkins case took place in 1991 and 1992. The Armstrong case took place 1999 and 2000, and so there's almost a decade difference in the time frame. But yet the gals that were involved, the victims, in both cases, I am a similar age to victims in both cases, and so
Really?
they
Hmm.
really struck a chord with me. They're my generation and I wanted to learn more about them. I wanted to know what things were like for them in their lives, how they grew up, what they liked to do, what their favorite color was, or what sports they might have played, or whatever, what they liked in school. I wanted to learn as much about them as I could because I really related to them because I'm of
Okay.
the same generation. And so definitely that aspect of researching the case was so fascinating for me. But yeah, the perp, when you're talking about a serial killer, the $1 million question, I think, is always, why did he take human life? And I think all of us were curious about these killers. When you have
Oh,
a book
definitely.
or a case about a single killer, I think even instinctually, maybe even subconsciously, you're wondering, how is he different from me? How is he or she different from me? Why did this person choose to take human life when I would never do that? So what's the difference? What's the difference in their childhood? What's the difference in how they look at the world? So
The
yeah, from
nature
a
versus
psych,
nurture aspect too. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
That is always what it comes down to. And I'm always torn on it. In both of these cases, I was torn on it. And I think I have to give a cop-out response of it's a mix. It's a mix of both nature and nurture
It can be
because
though.
it's just not clear. And with Atkins, much more than Armstrong, he is so complicated and he has so many unusual aspects of his background that really just make you wonder, okay, was it about that? Oh my gosh, he had a lot of things happen to him that a lot of people who live what we call a normal life would not have happened to them. So yeah,
Gotcha.
crazy.
That was going to be my next question is when you started getting more in depth with him, what stood out about his childhood and what, made you think it's like, you know what, maybe that was one of those triggers that led him down that path. Was his childhood real rough?
It was very rough. It was definitely a childhood of neglect in different ways. For one thing, he did not have a father in the picture. His
Hmm.
father left his mom when Ben was 2 years old. And so,
Okay.
absent father and really absent mother, too. His mother was pretty honest in her later years that she was working prostitution. She was addicted to heroin. She was here, there, and everywhere, but she wasn't there and present for her son Ben and Ben's older brother. Ben had a brother who was a year older than him, and they were always together all through their childhood and most of their adulthood too. So these two boys had to deal with their mom just not being there, and they were put into the foster system. They went from home to home. They got into a lot of trouble. They were skipping school. They were breaking into buildings. They had a juvie record together, and finally, they got placed in a home for boys, which was really rough on Ben. He had some things happen to him there, and he did some things that added to his childhood trauma too. So just a very unstable childhood,
Okay.
and then being discharged from the home for boys after 2 years back into their mom's care. Boys, what Ben's brother told his defense attorney later, Ben's defense attorney later, was that, yeah, we were just left to our own devices. Once
Hmm.
we got out of the home for boys and we were back with our mother, she still wasn't there. And so Ben started hustling on the street. And so he actually um, got into some abusive situations. He started working prostitution. He started doing
Mm.
drugs of different kinds. And that was his teenage years on up to early adulthood. He was only 23 when he was arrested.
Oh,
So
wow.
he had a pretty young life and really on the street most of the time, a lot of the time on the street, and with risky behaviors and a lot of trouble.
Gotcha. So his brother, them being so close in age and having the same style of upbringing, what became of his brother? Because I'm super curious
His
about, because we were talking nature versus nurture.
I wanted to talk to his brother so badly. I tried to
Ah,
contact him. I did
yeah.
not hear back. I think I found him through Facebook. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure I found him and did not get a response. That's how you find everybody in these cases. I will
Usually,
tell you,
yeah.
Facebook is unfortunately the number one tool for finding people.
We use it a
And
lot.
there's, yeah,
Excuse
oh,
me.
totally. People just give up all their information on Facebook. That
They
that should
really,
serve
yeah.
as a warning for people out there. Do
Yeah.
not tell everybody everything on Facebook.
Oh,
So I think I found him. I did not hear back. He is around. He is in Michigan. I think he's around Detroit. At least he was for a while. He may be up north of Detroit, elsewhere in the state, according to the Facebook profiles, multiple profiles that I found. Um, but as far as I know, did not really have any trouble with the law. At the time that Ben was committing his crimes in Detroit and Highland Park, his brother, he would sometimes stay with his brother, and his brother had a girlfriend, sometimes called a wife, and they were together for a long time. And Ben would stay with them, and he actually even felt close to his brother's girlfriend. But then sometimes he would be living homeless, sleeping in abandoned buildings in Detroit too. And his brother said that he did have to kick out Ben at Christmas time. I think it was Christmas 1990, if I remember correctly, because the drug thing. His brother had also struggled with drugs, and he didn't want to be dragged back into that. And Ben was just really thick into the drugs, and so he felt he had to boot him out because of that, because it was just going to drag him right back into that culture. And so I think he's lived a pretty stable life from what I can gather.
it's good.
Um, but I wish I could talk to him and find out, because there's so much I want to ask him.
Oh, that poor guy, man. He's probably been through it, as
Hmm.
everybody. It's yeah, I could see that for sure. I guess next question. What was the time frame? Because I noticed that they were quick. Like, what was the time frame from victim one to the last victim?
Hmm. Okay, so when things really sped up, when he actually started killing people, because he had attacked other people leading up to his
Okay.
first murder, and those were spaced out a little bit as far as we know. There was an attack in December 1990. There was the next known survivor, the gal from December 1990 survived. I interviewed her for the book. The next attack that we know of was fall 1991, so almost a year later. And Darlene was her name, and she survived, although she has since passed on. But she remembered it as school was in session. So it was September, but she was really thinking it was October. So we think that that attack was in October. The first time he killed someone was either November or December, and that was Patricia Cannon George. And we know that she was heard from around Thanksgiving. So it was late November or early December when she was killed. Okay, so that's probably our beginning point. We
Okay.
know that the last murder was the end of May 1992, the last day of May, because this was Cece Waymer, and Ben got injured during their scuffle. He had to go to the hospital to get stitches. And so the hospital records were in the early morning hours of June 1st, 1992. So we've got that pegged for sure. We're not so sure on the beginning point, but it could have been anywhere from 6 to 7 or 8 months span of
Wow.
killing 11 women. So
Wow.
that's why he got the moniker at the time of his arrest and the investigation and all of that, of being the country's fastest serial killer. And I think he
Wow.
might still hold that unofficial title.
I would think so. Usually, yeah, usually it's spaced out quite a bit. Most serial killers that I've, researched and stuff like that, it's always spaced out and
And they
um
have cooling off periods.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
pretty well known. He did have a cooling off period after CC Waymer at the end of May, and he claimed to police after his arrest that he had gotten off the drugs, and so he was
Okay.
trying to straighten things out. But that had happened before. He did go like this a little bit, and but he did have smaller cooling off periods in between, because some of these girls, it was like boom, 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 maybe three in the span of a week or two. So
Wow.
sometimes it was very, very quick, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks with nothing, and then another murder. So yeah.
That is interesting. That's really interesting. Just and what was his reasoning being on the drugs? Were those quick ones and was that drug related or
I think it was almost always drug related.
okay.
From the sounds of his confessions, every single one of those 11 murders, he had done some crack. He had just smoked crack.
Okay.
And that's how things typically went, is that he had this cycle of behavior. He was working prostitution himself, as I said. He was making money on the street, prostituting himself with men. so that he could get money to buy drugs. So there was that. And then he also claimed another very interesting aspect of this case after his arrest and in the investigation or in his analysis by some psychiatric professionals in the time between his arrest and his trial. He did claim to hear voices. He claimed to hear like these sort of alternate personalities in his head, one of which was named Tony, who was telling him to commit these crimes. And I bring up Tony there because talking about the cycle of his behavior on a daily basis, after he had prostituted himself, made some money, bought drugs, this Tony personality or voice would be berating him, like, why were you with a man? Atkins was very conflicted about his sexuality.
Mhm.
And so this Tony character was berating him, making him feel terrible, and egging him on to go find a female, to go be with a female. And to Benjamin, he was looking for, I think he was also looking for companionship to a certain degree. He was looking for his mother over and over because every one of these 11, 12, 13 women fit the demographic exactly of his mother. And so there was a lot of that in there, but it was also a cycle he kept repeating. So he would find a female on Woodward Avenue in Detroit or Highland Park, and he'd be like, hey, I got some drugs, let's go smoke. And it was really just a friendly casual thing. It was not about engaging the sex worker in sex, although that's what ended up happening. That was not the expectation that the gal had when he approached her and said, I got something, let's go somewhere,
Mhm.
and it's on me or whatever. It was all about going somewhere to do drugs. And I think these girls, they had seen him around Woodward Avenue. I think he was a very familiar person on Woodward,
Okay.
and they probably realized that he was working prostitution himself, what his deal was. And so they didn't feel threatened by him, and they didn't see him as a client in any way. They just saw him as this guy that they saw around.
Mhm.
So, that's what would happen, is that he would engage this female and they would go off to a dark corner. And they I think in every one of those cases with the 11 women, like I said, they actually smoked, they did drugs and got high. And sometimes she would get high as well, and things would get a little crazy and she'd be flirting or whatever, as he described it. I'm getting this only from him.
Yeah.
But it was said by his survivors and other people who knew them who had not been assaulted by him that when he smoked crack, he became someone different. He
Mm.
became a different person, almost demonic. So that played into it too, asking about, okay, is with the idea that were the drugs a factor? I think they were every incident. I think
Okay.
they were. And he probably engaged females in conversation or hung out with females plenty of times when it didn't go sideways and somebody didn't end up dead. So I really do feel like, in looking at the facts of the case, that the drugs were a very important element
Okay.
in the murders.
And I'm glad you brought up the mental illness aspect. Was he ever officially diagnosed after he got caught with anything?
He was diagnosed. Okay, there were four different psychiatrists or psychologists who evaluated him after his arrest, before his trial, at about a year and a half of time. The first one was a staff psychologist for the Detroit Recorder's Court, the inner city court, really just determining competency to stand trial. So
Yeah.
that guy didn't really dig into a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Then the next couple people were essentially for the prosecution doing an analysis of Atkins, and they started to hear what he was saying about hearing voices, the what he claimed about the alternate personalities and that sort of thing. And they largely felt he was what they called malingering, He felt like they were faking it. They did give him tests. There's like the MMPI test, I think the Minnesota Multiphasic. I couldn't even tell you what the acronym stands for, but it's a very well-known, largely done test, common test, I would say. And so they did a lot of testing on him, psychological testing,
Okay.
and they really felt like the voices thing, it was malingering. So then the fourth person to evaluate him was for the defense. So we're
Okay.
coming at it from a different
Yeah,
perspective. And
definitely.
his lawyer, when you have a client who's confessed to all these crimes and also has DNA evidence against him and has a survivor who has ID'd him, well, what do you do but an insanity defense?
Oh yeah.
And so he was going to go for that, and he hired a doctor out of Oakland County, Dr. Abramsky, and he evaluated him. And here's where we get to a sort of a diagnosis. Abramsky would not go so far as to say that Atkins was insane, but he believed that there was some stuff going on here. He believed he had a borderline personality disorder. He said he Atkins did not have split personality so much as he had what Dr. Abramsky termed splitting, which is a borderline personality disorder, and which was Atkins just having a hard time reconciling some of the trauma he had been through and it manifesting itself. And I'm not a psychologist, although I'm always interested in it, but I'm probably not going to even explain this as well as Dr. Abramsky would. Um, he had a lot of trouble, Atkins did, reconciling everything that had happened. And it was sort of a way to deal with some of his childhood trauma that he could not really face. He even
Okay.
said that he would hear about the crimes on the news. He didn't read the newspaper, but he caught the TV news now and then, and he would hear that a body was found here or this woman was murdered there. And it really wouldn't faze him that he had actually done that.
Hmm.
It was almost like it was compartmentalized somewhere else in his brain. And that's sort of what Dr. Abramsky was getting at with that, in that he couldn't deal with it. He couldn't really face it. And that's where
Yeah.
an alternate personality
Yeah.
thing kind of comes in, like, well, Tony made me do it. Tony egged me
Yeah.
on. Tony told me to pick up that female and take her over to the Howard Johnson restaurant and
It's
try
like
to
it's
kill
not
her.
my fault. That's Tony's fault, you know? Yeah.
Yes, yes. It was a way to take the blame away from himself. And he really didn't even realize too that, as many cops who worked the case said, he was killing his mother over and over and over, because these women were all drug addicted sex workers like
Hmm.
his mom, of the same
Yeah.
color as his mom. So he there were a lot of things that he just couldn't deal with. He just couldn't deal. And even when he was being questioned by police after his arrest, he told the one officer, Ron Sanders, he said, "Don't tell my mom about this, okay?"
Oh wow. It's
So
like a Norman
yeah,
Bates, man, like a black Norman Bates over here. Like
something,
shit, dude.
something. Yeah. They do say John Douglas, who is the well known FBI profiler, has said in at least one of his books, a book that I read, that a lot of these serial killers have mommy issues, even if they aren't killing their mom over and over or pretending to be their mom like Norman Bates.
Yeah.
They do have some issues with their mom, their female
Hmm.
parent. So, what is that about? That is like
It
a whole
is.
other discussion, I
It
guess.
really, yeah, it totally is. It's interesting to say the least. Now, you said before the murder started, there were attacks before that. Does it seem like he was building up to that murder and the severity of the attacks?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, was he trying to find like an MO? Did he stick with the same MO and everything like that?
Yes, he was
Okay.
very methodical. The first attack that we know of, and this is a gal who really had never told her story before. She kept it secret all these years, and this is the December 1990 attack. But I also can go back to the home for boys where he attacked another boy at the home too, and there's like some stuff there too. But as far as adulthood, as an adult male wandering the streets, when he attacked Margie in December 1990, the two of them started smoking, and she said he turned demonic. He turned into somebody else once that crack hit him. And they were talking, and all of a sudden she said he went for her throat. And so he was going to try to do like a strangulation thing. She started talking and she's like, "Hey, I got family. I got," and she's like trying to talk her way out of it. And finally she offered him money. And that was what got her out of it. And
Really?
she was able to run off. Yeah, that sort of
That
subdued
is
him.
surprising.
Yeah, isn't that?
Yeah, I figured money was not even a factor in any of that.
You would think, but this is early on. And then so the next attack with Darlene, he took her into the Howard Johnson restaurant that I mentioned, um, and he started attacking her. He actually raped her first, and she's like, you don't have to force me like this. You don't. She knew him for years on the street. She knew him by the name Tony, the name that he went by on the street. um, but then after raping her, he was trying to drag her down to the basement of that building. And she knew, okay, this is something else entirely. And so she was able to kick him, fight him, break free. She was a little bit bigger than some of the other females that he chose after that. So that maybe helps to answer your question too, as far as his technique or his MO, is that he did tend, at least police said that he tended to choose smaller females after that. He was trying to perfect a little bit. And they say that about serial killers, that when they first start out, they're not quite as good at it,
Hmm.
so to
Yeah.
speak. And so they falter a little bit in their first couple encounters or first couple assaults. They're just not as smooth as they can eventually become if they're, I guess, successful, unfortunately. So she was able to fight him off and she survived. She ran out of the building. Someone else arrived. She survived. But after that, he was able to successfully kill, and it was always strangulation. So the same
Okay.
MO. And I think
Yeah.
with Darlene, I think it was he actually trying to strangle her? Well, he had raped her and he was trying to drag her away. So I don't know that it actually got to the point of actually grabbing her neck and trying to, but it may have. But yeah, every time he was methodical and he would strangle the other victims, he would make sure that they were dead. And this was something he told police he read in a book. He actually read in a book about this. So, I mean, how can you be
Wow.
too insane, lawyers argue, if
Yeah.
you're that premeditated?
Yeah.
You're studying
You're
in
literally
a,
studying. Yeah.
yeah, because there's something of it. And again, I'm not a lawyer or a psychologist, but there's something about the insanity defense in as far as, if you can prove that they had planning and
Oh yeah.
motive and, repetition, and they're trying not to be caught and all of that, it doesn't do very well for the insanity
That
defense.
does not.
So he had read in a book that after strangling them, if they appear to be dead, to make sure, to push on their chest, to push air out, to listen for breathing, to feel for a pulse, all of that, he had read in a book. And that's what he told police later during his confessions, is I practiced all of these things. I put he would put both hands around their throat and push on the front here, and then when it was all seeming to be said and done, then he would follow those other steps just to make sure that that person was dead before he left her.
Wow.
And then he tried to hide her so that she would not be discovered. Really didn't want to be caught in that way, because he was making
Hmm.
a lot of effort to hide her after the fact. And a lot of these women were not discovered for weeks or months after they were
Wow.
killed.
That's honestly intriguing right there too. So he was half-ass successful in making sure things got hidden and all that stuff. Was there any records of sexual assault or rape on any of the how many of the victims? Any of them? All of them?
11 of the 11 women that were killed, I believe every time he told police that he actually raped her. And I think that the police found, the crime scene investigators evidence techs found evidence of rape every time
Oh
too.
wow.
And he raped them multiple ways also, which is, just so disturbing.
Very.
So yeah, it was a sexual assault every time, even though he had claimed to police that he was gay. And of
Hmm.
course, we know that rape is not really about sex so much as that it is about power. You know,
Yes.
the sexual
Control.
assault in that way is about power over your victim. But yeah, he was very conflicted in that way.
Did his brother or, his brother's wife, girlfriend, did anybody around him have any, any kind of thought that maybe, it was him doing this?
I don't think they had any
Wow.
inkling. His brother and his brother's girlfriend saw him now and then. Um,
Gotcha.
and there were even, like, after Atkins was arrested, there were people interviewed in the media after he was identified and it broke the news who he was. Then the media swarmed over his brother and
Oh
everybody who
yeah.
lived in the building, and they talked to the lady upstairs or the lady downstairs or whatever. And yeah, I used to bake him brownies sometimes, and they got that kind of thing. Like, he was so nice, he would run to the store for me. And he did have a nice thing about him. He did actually, one of the cops who worked the case nicknamed him Gentle Ben because he said he was never threatened by him. He was just average build. There was nothing menacing about him. His defense attorney told me the same thing. He could be sitting there talking to you. You would never know anything was going on with him.
That's
Um,
terrifying.
it was
Terrifying.
Yes, yes, it was
Uh,
very shocking to people who knew him. And I have a feeling, I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling his brother and his brother's girlfriend, who his brother's girlfriend is gone. She had
okay.
died a few years ago. Um, I have a feeling they did not know. Like, even as these murders are making the news, and it's very, very clear, it's very obvious to everyone that police are hunting a serial killer in Highland Park in Detroit. I don't think I would hazard a guess that his brother would not have suspected him
Hmm.
being this killer.
I'm glad you pointed on the Highland Park and all of that area where he would hang out. Did he ever mention anything about, after the first few killings, like the ladies out there kind of maybe, partnering up with other girls for protection or anything like that?
Oh my goodness. He said one thing to police. He uh, One thing that was chilling. Um, and I think it was when he was arrested for loitering. Okay, before his arrest in August 1992, after he was identified by Darlene as her attacker with police, and then he was arrested. And then the whole house of cards fell. Before that, in January of 1992, they had found one of the victims. I think it was Vicky Truelove in January, and and that was in Detroit. Uh, 8 of these murders were in Highland Park, 3 were in Detroit. And so, Detroit in January, they had found at least 2 or 3 women at that point, and they decided to do a sweep of abandoned buildings. And maybe that was Highland Park too, come to think of it. But they did a sweep through abandoned buildings, and they found this guy sleeping on a couch where he shouldn't be in an abandoned building. So they said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here. We're going to take you downtown. We're going to ask you a few questions because we're looking for a killer." Turns out it was the killer. They had no
Uh,
idea. And so they brought him downtown. They gave him some questions. And I think that was when, although he had also been detained in Highland Park that October, November before. Same thing, just being in a building when he shouldn't be in a big building. I think actually he was breaking into that building when he was detained, and he was brought up on charges. But this January thing, he was just sleeping on a couch. And so they just asked him some questions. They asked him, have you seen anything funny? Have you seen anybody acting strange around town? They were kind of acting him like, just trying to gather information from him. And he said, well, some of the girls out there are kind of scared. And one, a friend of mine, she told me, "Hey, when I'm out here, would you kind of watch out for me? Would you kind of keep an eye on me and make sure, somebody's not creeping up on me or something like that?" Isn't that
oh,
crazy?
that is so
Again, he was
crazy.
so disarming that these women had no idea. This was just Tony that they saw around.
And it
Yeah.
seems like when he got caught, he was extremely forthcoming with information. Is that correct?
At first he was denying everything. When the first Detroit police officer came to the room to interrogate him, it was about a day and a half after his arrest in August. And he sat down to chat with him. Maybe there was another officer there, and there was a closed circuit TV situation going on. It was not being recorded, but there was a closed circuit TV set up so that in another room, a couple more officers could watch. And so there were maybe 3 or 4 officers who were watching things, but one was tasked with asking the questions. And it was really a small talk situation. Like, this and that and the other thing, and not really getting around to the murders. And so the FBI agent who had been assigned case from the Detroit office of the FBI, because this was, by that point, it had become an interagency task force. So there was an FBI, there was Michigan State Police, and there was Wayne County Sheriff Department people helping out with it. So it was all kinds of agencies, and the FBI person decided to call in somebody he knew a good interrogator, and that was Ron Sanders. And Ron Sanders was on his way to going on vacation, taking a trip to Chicago, and he was interrupted and said, "We got suspect in the Woodward Avenue killing, so we kind of need you to come in and talk to this guy. We're nowhere." And so he came in, and he turned the small talk into real talk right away. He got into the
Wow.
room, and he's looking at Atkins, and he said, he looked at him, looked at his arms. "Where'd you get those scratches?" Atkins said, "My boyfriend did that. I have a boyfriend." So he was claiming to be gay, and telling police that he had no interest in women. And Sanders said, "No, your boyfriend didn't do that. The women did that because you killed them." He just was very aggressive and went right at it. And it didn't take too long for him to get Atkins to confess. And once he started confessing, he had confessed to all 11 women he had killed, plus the attack on Darlene
Wow.
before the murder started.
That is absolutely crazy. How did the trial go and how long did that last?
The trial was unusual because you had these 3 cases in Detroit and 8 cases in Highland Park. They actually did something unusual that I've never heard happening in any other criminal case. They had 2 juries. They had a jury for Wayne County listening to the 8 Highland Park cases. They had the Recorder's Court jury listening to the Detroit cases.
Okay.
So Recorder's Court doesn't exist anymore, but it was an inner city Detroit court to address Detroit crimes. And since it's been phased out. But so you had 2 juries in the same courtroom listening to essentially the same case, but sometimes if there was evidence or discussion introduced that was only pertaining to Highland Park, then the Detroit jury would be excused and vice versa. So
Okay.
the 2 juries wouldn't hear absolutely everything, but they would hear what was pertaining to their cases. And so they rendered separate verdicts at separate times and had separate deliberations. And the trial began in January 1994, and the verdicts were both reached a couple days apart in April 1994.
Okay.
So that's how long it took to convict him in both cases.
That is pretty wild having two juries at the same time listening to the same case.
Mm-hmm.
I can't recall a time I've heard of that happening before.
Yep.
That is really
Yeah.
wild. So what ended up happening to Tony, as I guess we should say?
Tony, yes. He was incarcerated in Michigan in 1994, and he only served 3 years because he died in 1997, September
Okay.
1997, with HIV slash
Oh,
AIDS
gotcha.
complications of some kind, according to the news reports.
Okay. Well, I mean, that is some crazy shit. I'm telling you right
Hmm.
now. What was one thing during your research though that I mean his childhood aside, I guess, was there something in your research that made you hold that sympathy card a little bit? Just getting to know who he was, his upbringing, his childhood. Was there a little bit of a, I shouldn't say sympathy, but a little bit of an empathy factor?
I think definitely he's the kind of killer who evokes that kind of response. a conflicted response.
Gotcha.
Like I always tell people, if you go, there's been a few podcasts about the case over the years, and they really just draw from the newspaper reports at the time and maybe give an
Hmm.
opinion, maybe give a perspective on, oh, this case is such and such. um, if you go and you look on YouTube, you search on Benjamin Atkins, not for the newer stuff that, like where I've been interviewed the past few weeks, but the other podcasts that have been past 5 years or so, when people have done a podcast about the case. If you look at the comments of those on YouTube, you'll see an array of different reactions. And a lot of people will come in and comment that he should have gotten help, that society failed him. And one of the jurors at the time, there was a holdout for a minute in the deliberations for one of the juries. And she later told the media, she said, I'm not saying that he's innocent or anything, but he should have gotten help. She was
Hmm.
really torn about that. And a lot of people do express that. So it is that kind of case that evokes that response. And for me, I do feel badly about his youngest years. I feel
Hmm.
badly about a kid left on his own without a mom or a dad. I almost wish that, I could have been a foster mom who would have helped in some way, who would have
Hmm.
been at one of those foster homes and would have been, some kind of good direction, some kind of good. And I'm not saying that the foster homes failed or anything, but I don't know. He was a troubled kid,
Hmm.
and you do have to wonder, okay, was he in a nurturing foster home that could
Yeah.
have turned things around for him, and he was with his brother? Was he in a loving home and he was just wired to misbehave? There was one of the females who was at one of those foster homes, who is reflected in his records with the home for boys, like his previous foster home history. She actually said that he was setting fires. And so that's one of the
Oh,
one of our
yeah.
markers
Oh,
for
yeah.
serial
Yeah,
killers,
it is.
the McDonald
Yeah.
triad. So you do have to wonder, okay, was he in an okay situation? It's possible. And he just was it. Maybe it was wiring, maybe it was brain
Yeah.
chemistry, maybe he just was not going to behave. He was acting out, and like I said, skipping school and breaking into buildings with his brother and all of that. And so I do feel bad for those kind of things happening to him. And I mean, every human being is valuable in a way. The
Hmm.
11, 12, 13 women were definitely very valuable, and they did
Absolutely.
not deserve to be killed. But a little boy who is growing up in such a situation, it's just so unfortunate. And he was valuable too. And I don't know. I mean, I'm torn because I
Yeah.
feel like maybe there could have been some things done, and it's just a shame that he had so many circumstances going
Hmm.
against him.
I guess I could totally understand that to a certain extent when people are like, well, society failed him. And it's like, well, he had a brother and there's 10,000 other people in the same society that didn't do that. You know
Hmm.
what I
Yep.
mean? And that's kind of, I mean, I'm not trying to be brash or just, write it off or anything like that, because there is always, that line where it's, sometimes society does fail you, and sometimes there's circumstances, you got to do what you got to do. But at the same time, nobody forced him to kill anybody. And his brother, who was right there with him, like
Is
he
not a
didn't do
serial
that
killer.
stuff, and
Right.
it's so I mean, I get you. Like, I'm torn too, like, to an extent. It's like, damn, man, like, that's a really sad and bad childhood. But on the flip
Mhm.
side of it, it's like, well, his brother had that same childhood and he didn't do any of that shit. So it's like, kind of, I don't know. I'm always torn about that. And it still, I don't know, it goes back to that nature versus nurture. And sometimes it's both, you just never know.
Yeah, and I think if you're torn by it, and if you do feel some empathy or sympathy, you're a compassionate human being, and
Yeah.
that's what we are all called to be.
It's what
You
we try to
know,
be. Yeah.
I mean, there's so much hate in the world. So, I mean, to show compassion, and even for a killer, I think is it can be a good thing. I feel like I'm going to be hated for saying that, but I don't know. We hate the crime, but we still try to love the person.
Absolutely, because I mean, everybody's human, and sometimes you get so deep, your actions do define your character, unfortunately. But that's a whole nother philosophical rabbit hole to get down right there.
Yep.
So, if you could tell my listeners one thing about your book that you're extremely proud of, that will get them inside that book and captivated by it, what would that be?
Oh goodness. I both of these books I set out to be as victim centric as I
Good.
could.
I like
And
that.
so that's why the beginning of both books has a chapter on each female who lost her life. And that to me is the most important thing, is that
Absolutely.
I hope that the reader, and I feel that the reader does, meet each female, because I set out with a very lofty goal of trying to get somebody to speak for each one of these 11 gals, and also Darlene too. I was able to speak to Darlene's son
Yeah.
Rashad, and that was so helpful. I was able to speak to Val Chalk's son Andre.
Oh,
That was
wow.
really helpful. I was able to speak to a few family members, but a lot of time has passed since the case happened,
Yeah.
and I think from their perspective, I was able to find somebody for every one of the females, but I didn't always hear back. And
Yeah.
again, um, it's hard. If I were in those shoes, would I want to talk to some writer I'd never met before about my deceased family member who was unfortunately killed by a serial killer?
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
So I totally understand that. So it was difficult, but I did piece together all the information I could from the files on
Hmm.
each one of these. And there is information on each one of the gals in there that I think the reader will meet them and they will see that they had a lot of normal aspects of their lives. A lot of them grew up in very good families, nuclear families, and had a
Hmm.
good start in life and had a wrong turn somewhere that put them out on the street. And it really was about drug addiction. And so that is a key part of this book too, and this case, and any case like this where prostitutes are targeted, frankly, because they tend to be out on the street because of a drug addiction. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
a addiction is a big part of this story too. So
Okay.
yeah, I would hope that the part of the book that really stands out would be the victimology, the meeting
Yes.
of all of these women.
And that's what I appreciate, is the fact that you're not just telling the story, you're providing insight, which is what I always, like I said, just appreciate, because anybody can go up there and tell a story, but having to go in and contact, family members, and do that extra amount of research to add that insight and add that context to the situations, I think that's really important. So I'm glad you did that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You are very welcome. And BR Bates, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. And
It
for
was
my
great. I
listeners,
appreciate
well, I appreciate it. And for
it. You do a good job.
yeah, thank you. It's casual. I always tell people, it's like there's no bullet points. It's like let's just start and just see
Yep.
where it takes us. And we're trying to get readers. We're trying to see what's in this book. And um, yeah, and for all my listeners, I will provide links in the episode description for this book and her other ones as well. So you can just go through the episode description, just click the link, and it'll take you right to it. And yeah, again, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm sorry I was
Thank you.
late.